Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Turnbull, co-chair along with Faye Taxman of the Criminal Justice Initiative of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Thanks everybody for joining us today for our third in our series of webinars on criminal justice issues, both as they relate to the pandemic crisis and more generally. Why a series on criminal justice reform? Social justice, equity, and fairness are cornerstones of our Jewish values. Jewish traditions are about how every human being has inherent human dignity and worth, about how we should treat each other the way we treat ourselves, and about our ability to make a difference in the world. The Torah mentions the obligation to love the stranger 36 times. For our Jewish community to fully live our justice values, we cannot hold ourselves at arm's length from those who are in need, especially now. Our work for justice must flow from being in relationship with people who are vulnerable, from listening to the stories that they share, and from standing up for their needs. At JCPA, we've been working in the area of criminal justice reform for several years, directly at the federal level and encouraging the Jewish community relations councils around the country to become involved in their local communities. At our last conference in February 2020, we passed a resolution emphasizing the importance of restoration and rehabilitation instead of punishment and retribution. We are offering a series of webinars on various aspects of the complex justice system to better understand the need for reform and to combat the myths about our current practices. Here at JCPA, we want to provide an opportunity to hear from experts, those on the front line of the work, and those that research criminal justice related issues, and those that are advocates. Today's program is devoted to pretrial justice. It's designed to increase our awareness of how important the pretrial phase of the justice system is in terms of future justice outcomes. Among practitioners in the field, there is a saying that what happens at pretrial affects all phases of the justice system. We have two experts today who are frontline on work in the pretrial reform. Before getting to our speakers today, I have one important housekeeping item. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. We will collect the questions throughout the initial presentations and then try to get as many as we can in the Q&A session. First, let me introduce Cherise Fanno Burdeen, Executive Partner at the Pretrial Justice Initiative. Cherise has spent more than 20 years working to improve public safety policies and practices throughout the country. Since 2006, Cherise has developed innovative strategies to raise awareness of pretrial issues, amassed a broad constituency of criminal justice stakeholder groups, provided technical assistance and training on policy reform, engaged in communications and media efforts. She serves as an issue expert for legal and correctional professionals, national and community advocates, the media, influencers, and artists. And unfortunately, we're having a little technical glitch with her video, so she is on by audio only, at least at this point. Maybe the video will come as we go. But go ahead, Cherise.
Well, thanks, Bruce. And yes, my inability to get my computer to function just negates anything good you said about me in terms of my qualifications. I cannot get this thing up. So I apologize. Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real honor for me to be here today, not just at the invitation of you all, but certainly to be able to be anywhere with my friend DeAnna. So I'm going to just set a small stage, and then DeAnna's going to really give you an amazing sense of what's happening in New York. First, just let me introduce the Pretrial Justice Institute. Since 1977, we have provided support to courts, corrections, local and state elected officials in an attempt to try to decarcerate America's jails of people who are in a pretrial detention status. Over the last year and a half, we have embraced finally the notion that there is really no pretrial justice without racial justice. And so as I lay out for you today what some of the key issues are around pretrial justice in America, that's the lens through which we look. I'm going to share with you some things you probably didn't know and hopefully spark some interest on your part in learning more. I'm not going to give you the history of bail in America in 10 minutes, but I am going to share with you some of the highlights about really what people are facing, what we're all facing, and why it's important that we all come together to try to work on this problem. Many people don't know the following things I'm going to share. So most people in jail across the country have not been convicted of anything. They are simply there in a pretrial detention status, meaning they have been accused of a crime and booked into one of America's jails, and they are sitting there, typically as a result of being unable to post a monetary bond that has been set. 95% of the growth in the jail population, so I'll just round that up to 100, almost 100% of the jail population growth over the last 20 years is simply pretrial detention. So we're talking about a voluminous problem. And I'm going to give you one more set of stats that can help contextualize the problem. And that is that we arrest around 11 million people each year in this country. And despite what you see on the news, and despite what you read on Twitter, and despite what you might think, the vast majority, somewhere around 85% of those folks are accused of misdemeanor charges. So you're talking about a high volume of people charged with low-level things, and even among people charged with felonies, the dichotomy of a misdemeanor felony has really shifted a lot over the last 40 years. But even people charged with felony, the vast majority of those are non-violent. So they're not person-to-person crimes. It's not saying we don't have any of those. It's just the vast majority of people who are accused of crime and booked into America's jails are folks who are charged with low-level things. Large volume of people booked into jails, getting stuck because they cannot afford to post bond. The purpose of the pretrial justice system is supposed to be a process through which an assessment is made about someone's likelihood to make all of their court appearances and to not be rearrested while their case is going through the process. Another fallacy you will see, or a myth that will get perpetuated in the news and certainly on cable TV, if you watch Dog the Bounty Hunter, which I hope nobody does, is that if we didn't have money bond in America, most people wouldn't come back to court. The truth of the matter is that all across the country and for decades, the vast majority of people return to court. They do not flee the country, and they do not commit a new crime, they do not get rearrested while they're out. So you have a system that is currently sort of trapping people in this system, and yet that's completely out of balance with any rational review of the risks that are being posed. And as Bruce mentioned, being incarcerated prior to trial has is the most significant impact on everything else that happens in the case. You are more likely to be convicted. You are more likely to get a sentence that includes incarceration. Not simply, there's nothing special necessarily about the fact that you were incarcerated compared to somebody not incarcerated before trial. Similar backgrounds, may be charged with the same thing. They will have vastly different outcomes simply based on whether or not they were able to deal with their case at home. Other issues include things like very quickly upon being incarcerated, you will, within a couple of days, you're likely to lose your job. That will destabilize your income. That income will destabilize much of your family. So money bond is technically what's keeping people incarcerated, but really it is a culture of incarceration that is keeping people incarcerated. And so that, in combination with what can only be described as racist policies, are disproportionately impacting people of color, but certainly nearly 100% of those policies are aimed at poor and working poor people. And so you have an opportunity in the pretrial stage to have a really big impact in a very short amount of time. And the solutions, after decades at our organization of sort of well-intentioned reform that produced very small outcomes, sometimes no outcomes, unless we were able to directly impact and address the culture of incarceration. So we are in support of the solutions that are generated by communities, that are generated by people closest to the policies, mostly impacted by the policies, most directly impacted. and look forward to being able to answer questions about those solutions, as well as anything else that folks in the audience are interested in.
Okay, thank you, Cherise. And we look forward to questions and discussion in a few minutes. Now we're going to turn to DeAnna Hoskins, President and CEO of Just Leadership USA. DeAnna is a nationally recognized leader and formerly incarcerated person with experience as an advocate and policy expert at local, state, and federal levels. Prior to joining JLUSA, DeAnna served as senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Justice, managing the Second Chance Act portfolio and serving as deputy director of the Federal Interagency Reentry Council. She has always worked alongside advocates who have been impacted by incarceration and knows that setting bold goals and investing in the leadership of directly impacted people is a necessary component of impactful, values-driven reform. So, DeAnna.
Thank you, Cherise. And I'm like Cherise, I don't want to take up much time. I really want to engage with the crowd. But I think there's some key points that Cherise spoke on about the historical nature around bail reform, the culture of mass incarceration, and the racial disparities that we see in the system. So a couple of things before I kind of talk about what happened in New York, what's going on in New York. I think, again, I just want to emphasize that bail only exists to ensure someone's return to court. It is not to say you're guilty of anything, and we tend to see bail associated with the charge. And so individuals start languishing in jail for a year, 2 years, only sometimes to even be found not guilty or to have charges dropped, but they have languished there. And as Cherise says, they've lost their job, they've lost their housing, and now they're in this cycle where they have to start over. Thank you, Cherise joined us. So when we talk about the dignity and the fairness of the pretrial system and bail, we're seeing the actual discriminatory practices that happen in bail with people coming in and out of the system. Again, we use Khalif Broder as an example of person, so much trauma was inflicted on an individual who sat in jail simply because his family was poor and he could not get bail, only to have charges dropped on him later. Again, when you talk about the 98%, so I like to use New York City. Rikers Island at one time housed over 22,000 individuals. And Rikers Island being a local jail, where the majority of the individuals were there because they could not afford bail. Pre-COVID, in January, right at the beginning of March, there were 5,500 people on Rikers. We are now at the historical low ever since 1950 or before that, of Rikers Island being up under 4,000 people. And that was kind of the initiative that the advocates pushed for, to get the population down as low as we could by introducing bail reform. So on January 1st, 2020 in New York City, after about almost 2 years of advocating, advocates were successful in working with legislators to pass bail reform in New York State. Bail reform eliminated cash bail. Certain charges could still have bail, but there were alternatives to bail. Bail does not always have to be cash. Again, it could be some of those diversion programs. It could be alternatives to incarceration. It could be some type of supervised release, some interaction with, if you are arrested and you have bail, some individuals, like we use the criminal justice system for mental health and substance abuse. People have quality of life issues. But we also have to remember that, again, as Cherise talked about, the notion that people won't return to court has been dispelled, and we're still living in that cycle that bail is necessary because without it, they won't come to court. But then the amount of bail, again, is almost eliminating their presumption of innocence till proven guilty. It's almost as if the bail is set because you're guilty until you get an attorney to help prove your innocence, which is very discriminatory. So after not even 90 days of bail reform, uproar started that crime rates were going up because we were letting people out. District attorneys, attorneys generals in the area, prosecutors were, in cases they should have retained someone because they had a probation violation, they were actually pushing back and not detaining individuals. And so when things started happening, law enforcement took a forefront. Bail industry, such as Dog the Bounty Hunter, those people stood up because we were interfering with their life. We were interfering with their luxury vacations. And I like to use the example, at the beginning of every year, every business, before the beginning of the year, every business makes a budget of what they need to make to break even. Nobody thinks about it, but bail bondsmen count human bodies with an estimated dollar sign of how many people they need to get processed through the bail system to collect those fees from their family so that they can continue to maintain the lifestyle that they have. And it reminds me of slavery, of slaves being put on the auction block with a price tag over their head, the same method that bail bondsmen do. So I don't want to take up more. I'm happy Cherise is on the screen. So, but I want to interact with the group in any way to answer any questions instead of going down a rabbit hole.
Okay, thank you to both Cherise and DeAnna for these presentations. And as we said, we really want to get the questions that you have there. You can either put them in, I guess there's a question box or the chat box, and we will get to them in a moment. Let me begin by asking, I talked about how JCPA has encouraged our JCRCs to get involved at their local level. And both of your organizations have outreach into the community. And so maybe I'll start with a question about how can our JCRCs connect with what your organizations or your people in the field are doing in the most effective way?
So for us, we have leaders who are actively engaged around reform in 42 states, including DC. And what I really suggest for people to do is at least a starting point, since people are spread out everywhere, is go to our website, www.jousa.org, and actually register to receive our newsletter. And what we do is highlight our leaders in the area and to be able to connect with some individuals so that you can join some of those coalitions and keep track of what's going on with Just Leadership as well.
And at PJI, we took DeAnna's advice, and so we hired one of her graduates in Cincinnati, Ohio. And we've had a lot of coordination with the community. It's a different acronym, you just said it, Bruce. It's
JCRC.
JCRC. So in Cincinnati and in throughout Ohio, that community and other communities are coming together to do some education and mobilization of advocates to be able to, and community members to participate locally. We encourage everything from voting, which is a really important component of bail reform. So as you just heard from DeAnna, politics is really what had sort of the biggest influence on bail reform in New York, whether they were able to influence or to be washed over by the politics in the fear-mongering that happened. And so being involved in local politics, being involved in local voting, and educating folks around how the system works, how it could work, and the kinds of outcomes that we can improve. So attending, actually, and we'll be happy to send this along, there's an education session coming up in 2 weeks, a statewide education session in Ohio. And it's really about getting involved locally and also learning about what's happening in your own jurisdiction. So most people don't know. I mean, I live 2 blocks from the jail here in Arlington County, Virginia. And if I didn't know better, I wouldn't know to ask questions like, I wonder how many people are in there. I wonder how long they've been in there. I wonder why they're in there still. I wonder what happens when they're out. I wonder how long it is before they get rounded up and brought back. So asking questions in your own jurisdiction about who's involved in those policy level decision making, who has the power to make changes, and then sort of where you are in your jurisdiction vis-a-vis outcomes, and what you as a community would rather demand are those kinds of outcomes.
I think I want to piggyback off of something Cherise said that is very important when you talk about people don't know. And these are tax dollars being spent. These are taxpayers' dollars. So what I always recommend people in localities and county, get your county budget, which is public information. Look at the corrections expenditure line. And then simply ask your county commissioner or open records request, what is the cost per participant every day in our local jail? And what is the estimated daily census? And start calculating how many days. And they have all this data and this open request because those entities are funded by your taxpayer dollars. And once taxpayers started seeing how much they're expending simply because we've criminalized poverty, we've utilized the local jail as a mental health facility, as a substance abuse facility, as a homeless shelter, then citizens who aren't not typically involved in this, that's how you start bringing the attention for the advocacy and working. Because again, normal people who aren't in this system or in this world really don't know how much of their taxpayer dollars are being wasted, why their property tax has to go up every year, why the tax in the state or the city goes up, is simply to fund. And I am here to tell you, typically everywhere I've been, the correctional budget is the largest line item budget in every county.
Okay, thank you. We've got several questions here. I'm sort of scrolling through what I'm being sort of fed by the JCPA staff. There's one here that I want to clear up. Cherise, when you were talking and you were giving statistics about misdemeanors and how many people were held and whatever, you were talking about jails. And we ought to make sure that everybody understands the distinction between jails and prisons, and whether the statistics that you were talking about were specific to the jail population.
They are. So if you are arrested, the first stop when you get out of that car is typically the county jail. It's a little different in New York City, but in most jurisdictions, you're taken to the county jail for booking. And so when we're talking about pretrial, people who are in a pretrial status, we're talking about your local jail.
And prison is where you may well go or likely will go if you're convicted.
Well, actually, sentenced, yes. Although you can serve up to a year, sometimes 2 years and longer in California now, longer in a local jail. I think what COVID has really brought into focus in a way DeAnna and I knew before, but now is on the front page of CNN and every other news outlet, are the conditions in jails. And so spending any length of time in most of our nation's jails is troublesome, certainly not rehabilitative, and we can and should be doing better by those folks as well as victims of crime.
I mean, one other sort of statistically related question is if eliminating bail seems to be the best first step. Do you know if the sentencing disparities hold for people placed in alternatives to incarceration versus if they're in alternatives before they're incarcerated or versus after versus being put in pretrial detention?
Yeah, certainly. People do better, and we've had that research for decades. I could expand on that, but the direct answer is yes, people do better. The case outcomes are better. I've had judges say actually to me, it is much more difficult to take someone who comes to court in street clothes with his or her family, who's been released and is doing fine, and it's much harder to sentence them to an incarcerative sentence than it is to return someone to lockup who has come out into that court in a jumpsuit. And that's just human nature. And so we ought to be doing everything we can to ensure that people are, and most people are absolutely entitled to their pretrial liberty, are coming to court from home.
Is another question here, which is similar to one that I had prepared but didn't ask yet. So I'll ask it in conjunction with this one. A very large number of those in jails really need, and DeAnna, you spoke to this, mental health or substance abuse help. Is there, sorry, let me read the question here. What are the specific solutions to that? What are the alternatives that are available for people who need mental health treatment or substance abuse help?
So one of the things that we definitely push for here in New York, and we're pushing across the country, is we have invested in this country heavily in law enforcement, whether it's police, courts, prosecutors, staffing at DOC, and we have literally taken from the social safety nets in our communities. And a lot of times what happens is we don't have the resources in the communities to address the needs. So one of the things with bail reform and pushing to close Rikers Island was the reinvestment of those cost savings back into our communities have been most impacted to increase and expand access to treatment. I remember, and here's a perfect example that really ties in the racial disparities that we see. During the crack epidemic, we all know it focused on criminal justice, even having a substance abuse problem, being caught with drugs and paraphernalia, you ended up with a sentence in incarceration, or you were sentenced to some type of programming, but typically you still ended up with a misdemeanor or felony conviction. Now that the face of addiction has changed, the money that is poured into public health, it is now a public health crisis. But we did not identify that when the face of it was different. It's still a substance abuse issue. The substance that they use is still a mood-altering substance that puts an individual in a position where they neglect everything, but the system has responded different based on a face. So if we could continue to pour those resources into communities to make sure individuals have access to it, that even when they encounter law enforcement, there's an alternative to receiving some substance abuse and some mental health services. But again, some states are doing it really well in cities where the mental health and substance abuse system is connected to the correctional system or law enforcement in some way.
Terrific. I think that's a very important point for those of us who are advocating, that we need to make sure that those savings are then invested in the treatment programs. Another question relates to someone's concerned about the lack of advocacy coming from the bench itself. In Q&A with local Nashville judges, this person was surprised at the lack of response from a panel of judges when asked about how they would reform the system. What's the experience with judges across the country and these issues?
I'll be happy to take this. So, you know, the bench has been a constituent of ours for the entirety of our 43 years. Our place was started by a judge, to be honest, back in 1977. And at the time that he started the organization, and in the time after, he was known as Cut 'em Loose Bruce. He got a reputation as being someone who honored the presumption of innocence and who believed in pretrial liberty, and so was treated differently by his colleagues because this was in the start of the war on crime, war on drugs. So I'm going to say two things about the bench. One, they are maybe three things. One, you're talking in most places about an elected official. So while you and I and law schools across the country might like to think of the bench as being a neutral party in the courthouse, my personal experience and our organizational experience is that that is a public perception, and that they are very much involved in politics at the local level. And they consider themselves accountable to their voters, not necessarily accountable to other judges or accountable to the court, their state court judges for the most part. And with that sort of incredible amount of discretion and that certainly lack of a feedback loop, most judges, in particular at first appearance hearings, they'll set a money bond and then they'll move on to the next case. They have almost no idea whether or not the person was actually able to secure release or not. Judges also, when you try to present education on the law to judges, you're kind of dancing in interesting waters. Many judges learned on the job are not as familiar with the state codes and statutes, and often are simply following the culture that was that they were trained in when they became a judge on that bench. So judges can be, on the other side, judges can be unbelievably powerful in a bail reform movement. So the Chief Justice in New Jersey, when New Jersey did bail reform, he was a major champion for bail reform. And in many state courts across the country, the Chief Justice, while they can't tell what state court judges what to do, they can begin to try to shift the culture. And as DeAnna says, try to return us from a presumption of guilt to a presumption of innocence.
And I would like to follow up on that too. As Cherise said, judges are for me, they're the main character when you start talking about bail reform, because they're the ones that set the bail. They can, whatever, it doesn't matter what the recommendation is from the prosecutor, it's ultimately the judge that hits the gavel and actually says this is what bail will be. My experience of working with judges is in most career positions, people have people they talk to, they kind of confer. We're in this jurisdiction together, we're in this courthouse together. What are you doing that we should be doing? They just don't talk to each other like that. They have their own thing. But also we have to remember, judgeship is like the ultimate position for a person who has a law degree. Right. It's almost this superior bow down, and once they make a judgeship, what they don't want to do is jeopardize losing that judgeship until they're ready. So again, as Cherise said, being accountable to their voters and not so much the community is huge for them to maintain that position.
Okay, we
Which
have
just
another.
circles back to that other point about getting people educated to vote. Because being held accountable to your voters would be great if your voters understood what job you're supposed to be doing and how you were doing on the job, like an evaluation of your performance.
And I think all elected officials should have an evaluation scorecard, like they work for us.
One question that we've got relates to the COVID crisis, and I'm going to ask sort of a variant of the question that the person put in. In this crisis, we've seen certainly a lot of advocacy to decarcerate, and we'll stick with the pretrial still here, and in some cases that actually has happened. It's been sort of spotty, I think, around the country, but in some cases it has happened. What do you think the experience is going to be whenever we emerge from this crisis and we've had the experience? I think that the other piece of this, and there are various reasons why this may be the case, but the other piece of this is that the rate of crime in many jurisdictions is substantially down. Certainly the number of arrests is substantially down. How do you think that experience and where we will be whenever we emerge, how will that relate to what goes forward in this area?
Go ahead, DeAnna.
And this is really a good question, because one, I'm happy they didn't say the question wasn't when we return to normal, because we don't want to go back to normal. Right. We don't want to go back to where we're over arresting, over incarcerating. I think is being demonstrated is that how much we incarcerate at the high rate, and that is not necessary. So I'll use the example, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and our Justice Center there, which is a jail, when I was director, it maintained a capacity of 1,600 individuals a day. After COVID and the sheriff making decisions that for the safety of the facility and the safety of those individuals, they started releasing. 98% were there pretrial. They are down to under 600. So what that shows is that we have been detaining people unnecessarily during a time when nothing was going on. So while COVID is very harmful in its effects and the terror that is reigning on our nation, I think for advocates, it has really given us the opportunity to start collecting data we would have never had. We would have never seen decarceration at this, then to take that and compare it to crime rates. Now, in some areas, people are screaming crime's going up because you guys are letting people out. The benefit we have here is that we have historical crime rate to actually look at. And typically in any urban area, between March and August, violence always peaks out. I used to do gang violence reduction. So what they may be seeing is the actual peak of the traditional violence in those areas, but they're blaming it because the system has started to do something different. But we're now going to be able to have data to say, did these people contribute to the spike in crime? Because now we can attach it to people who were released who typically would have been detained. And I think it's going to give us data, Cherise can follow up on this, but I think it's going to give us data around pretrial advocacy that we would have never had. And all the pushback that they gave us, we're now going to be able to go back to those arguments with pure D data. I don't know if you want to follow up with that, Cherise.
No, that's great, DeAnna. I think that, many of the things people are implementing in a COVID space were recommendations or reforms that were sitting on a shelf that they could have, should have, might have done before. The question I get asked by reporters is the same thing. What should we be doing now? And I said, God, I sound like my mother. If you just done what we told you to, you'd have been fine. And in fact, had you done what we told you to before, you wouldn't have had all these folks in these facilities. So, it's going to be also interesting from a data perspective to look at the comparison. I don't know if, I'm sure this data is already out there and I haven't looked. What's happening in New Jersey? So if they've had 2 years of bail reform in New Jersey, if they have been able to reduce the jail population of pretrial folks in New Jersey, then what is happening in comparison? Interestingly, I was on the phone with a public defender who said, misdemeanor arrests are down 80% in his jurisdiction, felony arrests are down 50%, but the jail population is hardly down at all because probation is violating people on technical violations. And so in some ways, you also have to understand the economics of a jail and how that all works. But I do think that there are opportunities as a result of COVID to see that things that people said were not possible before are possible. And my one last plug about that is mental health and substance use disorder as being prevalent in our nation's jails. Yes, we definitely need investment, reinvestment in mental health and substance use supports. We also should be asking, why are people mentally ill and using substances at such a high rate, and tying that back to economic justice. And so if in COVID we have been able to infuse the economy with the kind of money that we just did, I'm hard pressed to understand why we can't just invest in community, period. Because the truth is, a healthy, thriving community, that's public health, and public health is public safety.
I want to do one other COVID-related question, and that has to do with the information that's coming out, and again, if this is information that was there that we should have known anyway, but about the conditions in the jails. There's a lawsuit in Prince George's County in suburban Washington that is alleging that the conditions are are terrible. But in the specific COVID context, it is impossible to have the kind of hygiene that you're supposed to have, never mind the social distancing, but the hygiene is simply not available in these facilities. And I have to think that there are similar kinds of things happening around the country. And again, are those the kinds of things that we'll have information for afterwards that we can use to generate further reform?
So just to kind of tap into that, a couple of things are going on. The town hall that I did earlier with Dr. Homer Ventus, who is actually the former medical officer for New York City's jail system, is currently part of a team that is investigating and will be writing reports around correctional facilities and the conditions of them. They're doing surprise visits. But this is not new. When you look at the uprising, one of the things I like to share with people, typically when you hear about what people call a prison riot, I call them an uprising. And the reason I call it an uprising is because there's a law, the Ombudsman law, that prevents prisoners from actually filing lawsuits based on the conditions. So their only way to get acknowledgement and to bring to the attention the conditions is to create an uprising that soon gets national attention, although we don't like the way they go. But again, so think about prison, and what I tell people, the fact of people not having access to shower and soap, that's what happens when a prison goes on lockdown. Social distancing is impossible. Hand sanitizer is on the contraband list, so they can't have it. So everything the CDC has determined in the general public is what is necessary precautions we should take to be safe is impossible for people in correctional facilities, whether it's a jail or a prison. The benefit of a jail, again, is because the elected officials can make a decision on how overcrowded it is, whereas the state facility where a person has been sentenced, the director can't do anything about release until the governor makes a decision or the judge actually comes and redoes the actual sentence the judge gave them. So again, that's why you're seeing more movement in local jails, because it's very discretionary. You have judges who can stop bail, setting high bails. But also remember, the jail is in the community. So there's 3 layers there. You have the police who are not arresting at a rate. You have judges who aren't setting bail at a high rate. And then you have a sheriff that even if a bail has been set, he can make a decision on what is safe environment for his correctional facility and start removing people and letting them go until their court date.
Cherise,
Yeah, just a small piece of COVID commentary. Millions of people watched the Netflix show about the big cats, right? Joe Exotic.
I think I'm the only one.
Tigers, right? You didn't watch it. Millions of us watch those commercials about pets in really horrible shelters, and we all cry about the conditions of confinement. And yet, if we actually knew the way where other people were living, I hope we'd have the same amount of care and concern that we do for the big cats and the dogs and the cats in the shelters. These conditions of confinement are troublesome, but it's all symptomatic of a culture. So when we devalue whoever we're putting in those cells, then we don't care about their social distancability. We don't care about the sanitation. We don't care how long they're in there. And so it's really about bringing up the humanity of people. There are folks in there who, are sentenced to 3 months, who are dying. So you shouldn't die for a DUI. shouldn't die for not paying back child. I mean, these are like things that we're incarcerating people for. And the rates of highly transmittable infectious disease pre-COVID were also high. So flus, hepatitis, all of these sort of transmittable diseases have always presented major issues in these kinds of conditions.
We had a question that I want to get away from COVID for a minute, although I suppose it may have a COVID relationship. And that is, there are alternatives to incarceration that are in terms that people apply and say, oh, we can electronically monitor somebody. We can put a bracelet on, we can put an ankle bracelet on, we can put something on their phone. You want to talk a little bit about those and whether those are necessary or what the dynamic is with regard to those?
I think DeAnna and I have the same size soapbox. So let me just start by saying this. When I said earlier about the data, so you have a place like the District of Columbia or New Jersey where they're releasing 94% pre-COVID, 94% of people were home before trial. Over 90% are coming back, and over 90% are doing so without being arrested on a new charge. That is not under a surveillance state. Most people will come back to court, and if they miss a court appointment, they will show up within 24 or 48 hours. They will be in touch with their defense attorney. There's lots of reasons why people miss appointments. They're not getting on an airplane and fleeing justice. So let's just take the flight from justice out of it for 1 minute. The safety issue is that most people will not get rearrested during this period of time. So electronic monitoring is not a condition of supervision. It is akin to detention. It is akin to incarceration. So it is potentially a reasonable thing to consider if you're talking about the higher end, very small percentage of people. There are many jurisdictions who are putting out hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people out on electronic monitoring as a way to release them under COVID. And people usually apply a series of conditions of release under some notion of the more the better, protecting the public, and it actually has the opposite effect. And so the more conditions you place on people for whom those conditions are not related to anything that they might need, the more likely they are to violate those conditions because they're inappropriate. Most of us could not actually go through the day on the conditions that are imposed by courts. Does that mean that there aren't people with needs? Of course, we should be addressing those social service needs. We should be supporting them in the community if that's necessary. But alternatives to detention that are essentially detention at home in some way are not necessary.
So, and just a follow up to that, so we know there's 2 million individuals sitting in correctional facilities across this country, whether it's local, state, or federal. We know there are over 4 million up under some sort type of community supervision. And as Cherise alluded to, most people think, well, you're not incarcerated, but technically you are.
Right.
And what happens is, Bruce, I can be with you, and if I'm on GPS monitoring and we get pulled over by the police, all your rights have just been lost. Your car can be searched because I'm technically up under corrections control. If you get me rent out a room in your house, when they show up, they don't need a search warrant. And they can tear your house up. And I'm sure everyone's seen pictures of them, what we call flipping cells, where they go in and do a search of your cell, just throwing all your personal belongings right, really dehumanizing you. Your house and your children, who were just being nice to me to let me rent a room, have now lost all their rights. And officers respond in that way. And my question has always been, if I'm safe enough to put a bracelet on my ankle and go into the community, why am I not safe enough to actually just be in the community? Because here's the thing, if I truly commit a crime, I'm gonna cut the bracelet off anyway and just wait for you to find me. But the reality is, the conditions are what is violated. It's typically not people committing new crimes. And then also, you have to look at when we talk about the culture of incarceration, when you have a community, you may have one person in an elite community that may have done something, a white collar crime, and be on GPS monitoring. But another inner city community can have 20 to 30 people, and what you just did was put an invisible fence around that community and made the community in an actual replication of the prison, because officers are going to walk through, terrorize people who had nothing to do with it, and you now made our family members the warden without the compensation, right? Because now they have to make sure. So all of that plays a role in it as well too.
Am I right that there is a whole industry that's developed around this technology, and that many of the advocates for its use are actually the people who are going to make money on it?
I wanted to share that too, because so the monitoring companies, because typically counties and locals don't have the capacity to actually sit in front of computers, monitor, do the reports. When I was in Indiana, and the state of Indiana Department of Corrections privatized that out, there was a huge story, and this was around 2007, 2008, and one of my girlfriend's daughters was under that correctional control of GPS monitoring. The owner of that company was sexually harassing the women to perform acts in order not to actually lie on them on their reports. So when you talk about the sexual abuse, the mental abuse that happens to people, even women, especially women, even inside correctional facilities, it still happens on GPS monitoring, because there's someone who controls their life simply by how they report it to the state.
And Bruce, I know we're almost out of time, but I will say, you know, DeAnna and I, we have families, we live in communities, and we care about harm. And what we know is that the system as it is doesn't provide the kind of healing between parties, a harmed person and the person who harmed them. It doesn't do anything to support victims, and that most people who we arrest in this country are also victims of crime in their own life. And so maybe on another show, we can talk about all the solutions related to sort of restorative justice that really help heal communities. It isn't like we are bad parents who say, oh, let's just let our kids do whatever they want. We actually are good parents who would make our kids say, you know, you got to go restore the harm that you caused, and I'm going to get you help so you don't harm anybody else again. And so I think that's a whole portion of this that I want to say balances out our rabid love of the presumption of innocence, is the desire to see restored and whole communities.
Thank you, Cherise. That's a great segue to just sort of closing this out, because we began. I talked about the resolution that we passed in February. It was precisely on that point. It was precisely to say that what we need to get to is restorative justice, and so that is something that, yes, we'll come back, and those in the audience can look forward to a future webinar on that particular subject. So I want to thank our panelists, Cherise and DeAnna. This was a really interesting, lively discussion. I hope the audience has gotten as much out of it as I felt I did. And so I'm want to thank you. I want to put in a plug for two things for JCPA. One is that we have sent out an action alert. Did this several weeks ago, but it is still a live issue for people to contact their governors and their local officials to in the COVID context. And you know, yes, we should be doing it more generally, but specifically in the COVID context, they should be moving quickly to make sure that the jails and even the prisons are releasing people who do not need to be there. And so if you look on our website at jewishpublicaffairs.org, you can act on that action alert for your local area. The other plug I wanted to put in is that we are partnering with a group called Ending Mass Incarceration, which is a collaboration of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, the Auburn Seminary, and the Temple in Atlanta to do a new faith-based initiative on ending mass incarceration. And we are doing jointly sponsoring a virtual town hall with them next Thursday, the 7th of May from 1 to 3 Eastern time. And again, you can look for our alerts on that. So with that, I want to thank our panelists and thank everybody for being with us, and we'll see you again.
It was an honor, DeAnna. Thank you.
You guys, thank you, Bruce.